Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event. We are Socialist Fight Back, the Canadian section of the International Marxist Tendency. We are a Marxist organization fighting to build socialism in our lifetimes here in Canada and across the world. So I know a lot of you have already attended some of our events in the past, and that's great. So just bear with us while we might re-explain how everything works. So today, our topic is going to be on perspectives for revolution in Alberta, a really interesting topic right now, especially with everything the Kenney government has been doing. And so Lane will be giving this a lead off on this, and we'll follow that up with a discussion. I'll explain, how the discussion is going to run when we get to that point. We hope that we can get as many of you as possible participating in the discussion. So if you have any questions, comments, anything, please, use the raise hand function when we get to that point, and we'd be happy to have everyone involved. And so with that, I'm going to give the floor over to Lane to lead off on this topic.
Thank you, Emil. So the most unpopular premier in the country right now, if you exclude the guy who was just thrown out of the frying pan and into the fire in Newfoundland, from the equation, is Jason Kenney. In the past year, he's fallen from 61% approval rating to 42% now. And actually, the Alberta NDP is the second highest polling NDP province, second highest polling NDP party in terms of the provinces. After they got steamrolled last year, although it might seem like years ago that the Alberta election took place, it really only was last year. And they've since moved up to actually become tied neck and neck with the UCP, 38%. There's a pretty drastic swing here that took place. And I think it's a very small reflection of a swing in consciousness, especially considering the pandemic. If you think about it, most governments have actually enjoyed a surge in popularity or in confidence during the pandemic. Doug Ford, for example, went from having a 25% approval rating to double that to 50%. But Jason Kenney is one of the only ones that's gone in the opposite direction, actually. And I think the reason for that is fairly clear. And it's that the UCP government has continued to actively and enthusiastically conduct human sacrifices to maintain profits for the ruling class, especially the more dominant sector of the ruling class here in Alberta, which is the oil barons. These are not ritual human sacrifices or anything like that, but they have shown that they have nothing but contempt for working people and the oppressed, and they don't care if we live or die. They only care about profits. I'll give you a little highlight reel of some of their actions since February. So when COVID-19 came and it became clear that schools had to close to stop the spread of the virus, the UCP laid off 26,000 educational assistants and other staff. That was 1% of the province's workforce, and it's also the largest single layoff by the largest layoff by a single organization in Canada's history. And this is also when the EI system was getting overloaded with millions and millions of people, requesting EI. And they did this in the name of saving money to fight COVID-19. And they did save $128 million doing these layoffs. And it was only 3 days later that the UCP set aside $7.5 billion for the Keystone XL pipeline, which in itself was a huge bailout for the oil industry. They set $1.5 billion aside for an ownership stake and $6 billion in loan guarantees for a pipeline which is now tied up in courts and likely won't see the light of day. So that $6 billion in loan guarantees is not looking so hot. $7.5 billion is 58.5 times the amount of money that they saved by laying off EAs. I think this is the perfect illustration of what their priorities are right there. And in terms of actually handling the virus, to fighting COVID-19, the UCP's lockdown was an absolute joke. Kenney actually bragged about how light the touch of the Alberta government was, and that 85% of businesses stayed open during lockdown, as if that was a good thing. And the result is that Alberta has actually led the provinces with the highest number of cases per capita for much of the pandemic. And there was also some really awful outbreaks in certain workplaces, the worst which being the Cargill meatpacking plants, where you had a government inspector declare the plant safe from a video call. They refused to step foot inside the plant. And it would go on to become North America's single worst workplace outbreak at that time. And despite complaints from the workers, warnings, pleas, everything, the UCP did not actually shut down the Cargill meatpacking plant. Cargill shut down themselves voluntarily. They did not want to step in the way of Cargill making any money. Fun fact, the general manager of that plant, his name is Dale LaGrange. He's actually the nephew of the UCP's education minister, Adriana LaGrange. They've accelerated corporate tax cuts, which were already the lowest in Canada. With Bill 32, an attack on the labor movement, they've more or less made picketing, striking, and protesting illegal. They opened schools on a whim with no extra funds, more kids, and less staff. It actually seems like the general process was just to throw the kids into the building and see what happens. Also, that their parents could go back to work and resume making their bosses more money. And so right now, 187 schools, it's probably more now since I last checked a couple hours ago, 187 schools have cases of COVID-19, 47 of which have outbreaks, and another 7 of more than 5 cases. There's an ongoing review to actually cut the AGE program, the program for the severely handicapped in Alberta. You know, Kenney always talks about saving lives and livelihoods in terms of fighting COVID-19. I think that shows which livelihoods he cares about, not people on AGE, that's for sure, but the bosses. And perhaps the most cynical and revealing attack is the UCP's insistence on gutting the healthcare system so that they can take the money that goes into healthcare and give it to the oil barons, all during a pandemic, right? Especially their attacks on doctors, attacks to the payment, the payment system for doctors. And now, as a result, the doctors are leaving the provinces, or leaving the province rather, going to other provinces. In Jason Kenney's pandemic speeches, he often compares the pandemic response to the Battle of Britain, which, it kind of makes sense, a war analogy, mobilization, things like that. But in this case, if you were to actually take the analogy to its conclusion, it would be Jason Kenney himself executing half the medics, right? It doesn't make sense. And people are seeing that and they're not happy about it. Now, the health minister is arguing that doctors are not leaving, that it's fake news, that it's an NDP scare tactic, blah, blah, blah. But actually, some leaked Alberta Health Services government documents show that there are at least 160 high-risk doctors who are high risk to leave in the short term, many of which have already given notice. And there have been plenty of small towns which have had dozens of doctors, even like a dozen at a time, say that they are going to close their practice. Some examples, Stettler, 12 doctors are leaving the province. Sundre, 14 doctors at 2 practices. Rocky Mountain House, 16 doctors. Crow's Nest Pass, 10. Lac La Biche, this was one of the first ones. 10 out of the 11 doctors in the whole town are leaving the province. Now, there's an ongoing back and forth fight between the health minister and the doctors. And one of the things that the government did in order to try and separate the myth from the fact was place a fact sheet on the Alberta government website. I'll give you a couple of the myths here that they say. Myth number 1, doctors are leaving Alberta because of the new physician compensation framework. That's not a myth, actually. Unfortunately, that is a fact. And then this is another interesting one. Myth, the government does not respect Alberta's doctors. I don't know where they get the myth and the fact. Anyway. Now, to an extent, governments everywhere are prioritizing profits at the expense of health and safety for working class people. All throughout Canada, all throughout the world, that is a fact. But I think in Alberta, it's a little bit more acute. And actually, it's very acute. In most places, the government right now isn't enthusiastically undertaking austerity measures that kill people right now. Right? For example, federally, we have Justin Trudeau. He's a decent example. He represents the more enlightened and the more well-dressed bourgeoisie if you will. And his method is the opposite of Jason Kenney's, right? He's kicked out his conservative finance minister. He's borrowed and printed a lot of money. And when he's been, when he's faced a lot of pressure from below, he's actually given out a crumb or two in reforms. Now, Trudeau very much represents the ruling class. So when that pressure from below eases, he does try and take the crumbs back, but he actually acknowledges the existence or the possibility of crumbs. And he is also actually pleading to the ruling class of other countries and the world to reform. For example, there's this quote. He says, "The system is broken and the world is in crisis. And things are going to get much worse unless we change." He's basically telling them to reform before there is a revolution from below. And if you look at Jason Kenney, he seems to be the exact opposite. I think if you look a little bit deeper at the UCP, at the ruling class that they represent, and at the general situation, you'll see that things have shifted. The Alberta that we live in, that I live in, probably not everybody in the Zoom call, is not the same Alberta that existed 20 years ago. And the oil barons that the UCP represents are not the same oil barons that they were 20 years ago. Things have changed. The economy has changed, class relations have changed, and with that, consciousness is changing, and it's changing fairly quickly. I think it's worth it to outline this process and go back a little bit and talk about what has taken place. And to do that, we have to talk about oil, because Alberta's economy has lived and died by the tempo of the oil patch for the past 50 years. And since 2008, the Alberta oil barons have slowly but surely been losing their export market. And with that, there's a danger of them losing their profits. There's been a general decline in Chinese demand for oil, and there's been a huge boom in American shale that's pushed them out. So the solution of the oil barons at first was to crank up the volume of oil that they were selling. This might lower the price per barrel, but with a higher volume, you sell more. Even with a lower rate of profit, there would still be a higher volume of profit, right? They still come away with more money. So for example, in 2008, 7.8 billion cubic meters of oil was produced, and that swelled up to 13 billion, almost double by the beginning of 2014, within 6 years. But this strategy has its limits. And I think that became very clear in 2014 when oil prices fell through the floor. Now, this is what Marxists would call a crisis of overproduction, that we were actually too good at producing oil, that there was too much inventory, and that the market could not absorb all of it. And so we had a crisis. We had a crisis of plenty. Prices crashed, companies went bankrupt, tens of thousands of people were laid off, and oil-based economies around the world were hit very hard, Alberta included. Now, despite that, the oil barons in Alberta actually doubled down on this strategy to the point where last year in December, Alberta was producing 18 billion cubic meters of oil per year, exacerbating the crisis of overproduction. Right? But in order to make money throughout this process, they've been viciously cutting costs. Productivity has been jacked up. There were more layoffs. Wages were cut to as low as they possibly could be, and they attempted to scrape by selling at a discount. So for those 6 years or so, from 2014 to 2020, the oil barons could make a small profit and keep their heads above water, around $50 to $60 per barrel. But now that the overproduction of oil has actually continued and deepened, and that Alberta oil is selling at around $30 per barrel, things have come up against the limit, and the oil patch is in a very deep crisis. There's been a 25% drop in oil production this year alone. Right now, for a province based on oil money, obviously this had a massive influence on politics and a lot of other aspects of life in Alberta. Because back when the oil money was flowing, there was stability. There was relative class peace. There were very few fights within the ruling class. But that Alberta is good and dead. And when the oil money began to turn into a trickle, the stability was replaced by crisis, by polarization, and in general by the opposite, right? By instability. And now the crisis of 2008, it accelerated a division within the ruling class to an all-out split between the Wild Rose and the PC. And in 2015, Alberta elected an NDP majority, actually, seemingly out of nowhere. Alberta was thought to be this reactionary haven, right-wing, Stephen Harper, Ernest Manning, Bible Bill Aberhart, Canada's Texas, we can go on. But the fact is that this didn't come out of nowhere, right? I think this is the economic crisis, or the two that took place prior to that, expressing themselves politically. The PC governments wanted to place the burden of payments on the working class, wanted to unload the crisis with cuts to healthcare and education, just like things had always been done. But working people were becoming more aware that their livelihoods and that their wages were being eroded. And this crisis had this polarizing effect between two poles. On the one pole, you could call it the left pole, I guess, you had progress, equality, rights, socialism, the working class pole, working class wing of society. And on the right, on the other side, you had austerity, barbarism, oppression. You can call that the bourgeois wing. And now there wasn't enough money to buy class peace anymore. And so the whole of society had to actually pick a side. And this polarization is something that's taken place, albeit unevenly all around the world. But in Alberta, it happened early and quickly, as with the economic crisis. And the NDP victory showed that. I think it was a turning point for the class struggle in Alberta, not just some protest vote, right? And unfortunately, the NDP was unprepared or unwilling to challenge capitalism. They had illusions in working with the oil barons to rule for all of Alberta. And so they got steamrolled by the oil barons. But all the while, in the past 5 years or so, the general process has continued, actually. People are moving from the rural areas to the cities. The oil jobs are drying up. Wages are getting lower. Employment in general is hard to come by. A lot of oil companies have given up, closed operations. Alberta's GDP has stagnated or shrunk on a yearly basis. And the economy has changed drastically, right? Alberta is not the economic powerhouse that it used to be, to the point that this year, Alberta is taking a huge amount of money from Ottawa, especially in COVID stimulus. Alberta will be a net receiver of federal money for the first time in 55 years. Usually the feds collect around $20 billion or so per year from Alberta. And this time it's actually the reverse. $22 billion is coming in. Maybe that could change the Wexit people's minds, make them want to stay. My cup splashed water on my nose. My apologies. And with the economic change, you could really see the crisis with some stats. Like, for example, Alberta has the worst mortgage deferral cliff right now. More than 1 in 5 mortgages are being deferred, and those have a danger of becoming solvent. That is worse, actually, than if those were to all go delinquent, that would be worse than how things were in the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis in the United States. Alberta's unemployment rate as well continues to be the highest in Canada. So all of these things, they have an effect on consciousness, albeit uneven. And the thing about consciousness is that it's generally conservative. It tends to lag behind events. But you can only ignore reality for so long. Eventually, you have to face it. And eventually, consciousness does catch up to events. And the thing about the working class is when working class consciousness catches up, it catches up with a bang. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. Not just with the unpopularity of the UCP. We've also had massive protests and demonstrations all over the province in places you wouldn't expect. Innisfail, Alberta, Red Deer, Fort McMurray, every little dot and small town, for example, during the Black Lives Matter movement had a demonstration. In Edmonton, it was the biggest demo in a long, long time, around 15,000 people. And actually in the past, as a socialist organizer here, we tend to, meet people who got interested in socialism because they were radicalized by international events. Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, Corbyn, Brexit, the Gilets jaunes movement in France. But now it seems to be that actually events in Alberta have a radicalizing effect here and actually throughout Canada. And to give another example of the change in consciousness, 51% of Albertans believe the province should transition away from oil and gas and move towards renewable energy. That poll was taken this spring, 51%. That's a majority. So don't let the right wing tell you that Alberta is a reactionary haven. We love oil and gas and everything. 51%. The situation has changed. Consciousness has shifted. It is catching up with events. And yet the UCP and the ruling class that they represent do not want to budge. They insist on trying to rule in the same crass and vulgar way as if nothing had changed. I think you can see this from some of the comments that they make. Right? Kenney suggested in the legislature that teachers should tidy up their workplaces because, of course, school boards had to lay off all the janitors because of their cuts. The logical conclusion of that, and this is happening, the logical conclusion is that you have unlabeled bottles of dangerous cleaner, chemicals like Oxybar that are used by teachers who've never read the data sheet and don't understand how it works and how dangerous it could be. About the whole school reopening, the education minister said that the plan is working. Yeah, I think that's quite ridiculous, right? That she is defending it. There's not even an admission that there's a problem. There's, of course, the example of Tyler Shandro, who's the health minister in Alberta. He owns a private health insurance company with his wife, and some of his hobbies include looking up doctors' information illegally, going to their house and screaming and crying at them when they argue online against his efforts to privatize healthcare. This guy has an anger problem. I highly recommend everybody go on YouTube and look up Tyler Shandro responding to journalists because he is unhinged. There was the example the other day. You had a UCP MLA say that people were using the CERB to buy cheesies. I remember that specifically, illegal drugs and something else, right? There's got to be tens of thousands of laid off workers, probably in heavy industry, a lot of them up north where the UCP's base, who have been taking the CERB and who look at, UCP MLAs who are saying things like this. And that has an effect. And of course, you have the finance minister. I'll read this phrase. He continues to repeat it in some iteration in one way or another. And I think this indicates that they refuse to change tact, even with the pandemic. This is the phrase that he uses, the most recent iteration. He says, the pandemic, the energy price war, and the global economic contraction blindsided our economy, just as it was beginning to show signs of improvement and approaching pre-recession levels of economic activity. And usually, of course, this is combined with some lie that their corporate tax cuts were working or something and bringing in investment. And this phrase really reminds me of the scene from the American version of The Office. I'll keep it short for those who haven't seen it. But Jim pulls a prank on Dwight so that his drawers only open 3 inches, and Dwight's struggling to open the drawer. He's like, "Oh man, come on, just when we were really getting going." That's how I imagine Taze is saying this. But the fact is that every single word is a complete lie. There was absolutely no way they were approaching pre-recession levels of economic activity. They were showing no signs of improvement. Actually, 2019 was the worst year for investment in the provinces in the past 5 years in the province. Alberta had been on a terminal decline up to that point. There was no sign whatsoever. Sorry, I'm a little bit worked up about that one. And I think these things, they show the UCP has a refusal to reform or adapt to the situation. And in some cases, actually just ignore reality to their best efforts. They're mimicking their bosses, the oil barons, with their short-sightedness. So they've essentially turned into high-stakes gamblers, and they're selling tomorrow for today. Now, to a small extent, they have actually changed a few things, but only slightly, right? They've taken up a big budget deficit this year, one that they weren't planning to pay for their corporate tax cuts. And they also postponed laying off nurses, around 750 of them, and a few other counter reforms, because these things were not really options. They would have, erupted. They would have triggered so much anger that pitchforks might have been coming a little bit early for them. But they've more or less stuck to their plan, stuck to their guns, where other provincial governments would not. So far as I know, they're the only government that has actually contributed no funding to their school reopening. School boards this year opened up with more students and less money than they had 2 years ago, and the pandemic, of course, which they have to contend with. So there is a general uptick in the class struggle, and we can expect this to get bigger as the UCP cuts get deeper. as the crisis gets deeper. For example, at a demo late last year, around 1,500 people actually began chanting from the crowd, calling for a general strike. Kenney even actually had to address these calls for the general strike at the UCP convention. And he pleaded to the unions to collaborate with the government instead of fighting it. There's a huge amount of anger, especially concentrated within the public sector, in schools and in hospitals. For example, there's a poll conducted by the ATA, the teachers union, of 1,600 teachers, and it showed that 94% of teachers felt extreme and unsustainable levels of fatigue. We've made it 10% through the school year. If there's extreme and unsustainable levels of fatigue, this cannot go on, right? Something has to actually reach a breaking point here. And of course, the same is true very much so with hospitals. There's an enormous surgery backlog, all of the stress of the pandemic and all of the stress of the cuts. This is the kind of thing that revolutions are made of. Consciousness catching up to events, economic crisis, and a ruling class that's unwilling to change. And it has the ability to actually move faster than we can expect. This situation is one that reminds me actually of the decline of the British Empire, strangely enough, especially during the 1920s. British people, just like Albertans, were thought to be conservative. It's thought to be a bastion of reaction. It was said in Britain that change was very gradual. British capitalism was strong and stable, and it was based on its industry. On the surface, it seemed like that, right? Based off of its industry, based off of the colonies. But over a period of time, the basis for that stability was slowly undermined. The wealth from the colonies dried up or was eventually cut off. And Britain was outstripped economically by France, Germany, the United States. And following World War I, its economy stagnated. And from stability, it turned to instability. The ruling class tried to pass the economic burden onto the working class, attacking wages, especially in the mines. And eventually, the British working class stood up to these attacks. Consciousness caught up with events, and they led fierce class battles that actually culminated in a general strike, which very well could have overthrown and ended British capitalism. And this is an interesting tidbit. Listen to this one. The Trades Dispute and Trade Unions Act in 1927 in Britain banned sympathy strikes, mass picketing, and created a system whereby trade union members had to opt in to paying the political levy to the Labour Party. If you pay attention to Alberta politics, all three of these things were actually preeminently done by the UCP in Bill 32. Optional opt-in pay to the NDP, banning sympathy strikes, and banning mass picketing. Now, guess what? Making pickets illegal didn't stop them, and it probably won't here in Alberta as well. Good, I didn't get any on my nose that time. Now, every historical parallel has its limits, right? But just like the British workers in 1926, the Alberta working class is going to move in a big way at some point. And once they do, there's no rule, there's no law, there's no hypothetical provincial police force that Jason Kenney can actually subdue them with, rather. But also, like the British workers, they need to be armed, actually, with proper ideas and proper methods to defeat Jason Kenney. In 1926, in Great Britain, things did go a different way. Even though the British workers had more than enough energy and sacrifice to actually do the job and to overthrow the regime, they were sold out by their leaders on the Trade Union Congress. And that energy dissipated, and they were left demoralized and defeated. To defeat Jason Kenney, to overthrow him, to grab him by the ankles and throw him in a tailings pond, which I think is an important demand for the working class, the movement in Alberta needs to be armed with militant ideas and correct ideas and Marxist ideas. And that's something that we want to help with. And if you want to give us a hand, we'll be happy to have you. So I'll leave it there and I'll open it up for discussion, or pass it back to Emile, rather.
Okay, Thank you very much, Lane. That was an excellent lead off you gave there. So now we'll move on to the discussion portion of the event. So how this will work is, well, first of all, we've got, we should have lots of time. So please pitch in with, any questions, comments, anything like that. And we should have time to get to everyone. So for any questions that you have, ask them, and they'll either be answered by someone else in the discussion, or Lane is going to do a wrap up as well. And he's going to touch on all those questions and, give a good answer to those. The way we can do it, I see people are already starting to use it. We've got a raise hand function as well. You can use under the participants tab, just use the raise hand function there. Also when it gets to your time to talk, we'll have someone, will unmute you, and all you have to do is, it's going to ask, the host wants to unmute you. You can just hit that. You don't have to hit the unmute button down in the bottom. If you're, once you're, giving a question or a comment, we ask that, you turn on your camera if you do. Raised their hand.
Emil, we
yes.
lost you about 20 seconds back.
Oh, my apologies. Sorry about that. My internet must have cut out a bit. We just asked that everyone, turn on your camera if you have one, just to make the discussion a little more like real life. And we'll keep discussion. Each person will have about 3 to 5 minutes to talk, and I'll give you a visual cue to wrap up once we get there. And if you're going a little bit over time. And also I'll be making a list, so I'll lower your hand in the lower hand function. So don't worry if it gets lowered. I've got you on the list here. And also, please introduce yourself before you speak, and let me know if I butchered your name. Please correct me. We're also going to have, after the discussion and after Lane gives his finishing statements there, his wrap up, we're going to move into breakout rooms. And that way it's just a little more casual discussion. Also, if you haven't checked it out yet, you should have a look at our paper. We're going to post a link to the chat here where you can, subscribe to our paper and, check out some of our opinions and everything. Check out the Marxist point of view. And so with that, we'll get started now. So we'll start here with Chad from Calgary. We'll just get you unmuted in a second here.
Hello, I'm Chad. Nailed it. And I guess I just more than anything have a question. In Alberta, as anyone who lives in Alberta knows, there's like a deeply entrenched and ingrained religious history and section of the population. And I guess my question is, how does Marxist philosophy, or like how do we as the people who want to mobilize under the idea of Marxism reach out to or coexist, or can it coexist with such a deeply religious population? Or I understand the idea is that we're trying to mobilize as a working class, but how do you reach across lines where, for somebody with family in this province, you can find common ground with them on the idea that this government is bullshit and that they are doing horrific things, whether it's parks or teachers or whatever, but how do you get across to the people who just so deeply believe that the left or like any sort of movement like this would work against their religion and their belief systems? Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So next up, we will have Merrill Chen, and then after Merrill, we will have Michael.
Hi, can you guys hear me properly? Okay. Hi, I'm Merrill. I'm in Fort McMurray. So like my occupation is pretty much working for the past 4 years anyways. I've been working like in the oil fields, and pretty much everything that was said was pretty much accurate. Right as I went back during the COVID crisis, there was just everything was just cut down. They had people stuffed into these trailers like sardines, and you know, they where we work, they didn't even bother to put like a wash cart there, so we had to walk like 30 minutes just to get to the washroom. And you know, furthermore, there were the constant talks of every single trade there getting cuts, whether it's from losing a double time to 1.5, and then even 1.5 is like running on some kind of a technical thing. It's like, oh, it's got to be under these kind of conditions. And I've tried speaking to a lot of the people, and the sentiment is pretty consistent that most people think that the government in power is basically kind of working against them, and you know what, even the unions that our unions that are supposed to kind of help us have kind of fallen into this bureaucracy. It seems like it just doesn't matter, because I'm pretty sure nobody voted for wage cuts and nobody voted for losing of the double time, but for some reason it just happened anyways. But the sentiment that kind of keeps, I guess, everybody at bay in a sense seems to be the same. We are in debt. If we took a stand against this, we're going to lose our jobs. How can we even, how can we, strive for change without, potentially kind of screwing ourselves over in that sense? And that's one of the things that kind of don't really have an answer to that. And perhaps, hopefully, you guys here can kind of give some kind of a response to that. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much. Okay, so now we will move on to having Michael speak, and then after him, we're going to have Kevin. So we've actually got our link up now to our paper, so you can check it out there. Subscribe to the paper. We're doing online versions now as well. You can have them emailed to you and check that out. So we've got lots of time here today. So, I noticed that we don't have a lot of speakers yet on the list. So please, if you've got any question, any sort of comment, please just, raise your hand and we'll let you speak. No need to be nervous. But with that, we will give it over to Michael then.
Hi. So my question is simply, how strong are teacher unions in Alberta? And how have they been fighting with the government on their rights, I guess?
Okay, thank you very much. As I said, Lane will try and answer all those questions right at the end too. So with that, we will move on to Kevin here will be next.
Awesome. Thanks, Emil. Thanks, Lane. Hi, everyone. This is Kevin. So the topic of tonight's discussion is perspectives for revolution in Alberta. Class struggle and even revolution are actually nothing foreign to Canadian workers. The West often gets a bad rap, especially Western workers, who are judged in the bourgeois press to be a little more than a reactionary rump to the national labor movement. Despite examples which seem to justify this attitude, Western Canada is actually home to a revolutionary history essential to the traditions of its working class. The Winnipeg General Strike, actually, and the spread of sympathetic strikes deserves to be remembered in this sense. At that time, a high-level class struggle was sweeping across the nation. Well over 3 million striker days lost were counted, and general strikes were actually on the order of the day from coast to coast. But in 1919, the chickens were coming home to roost in Western Canada for the nation. Several objective factors contributed to the revolutionary situation in the West. But the presence of a revolutionary political party standing on a program inspired by Marxism and active within the movement contributed to a high level of class consciousness amongst Western Canadian workers. And actually, this party would go on to play a leading role in the revolutionary events in the West of 1919. As a backdrop to those events, it's always interesting to think about how there was a backdrop of pandemic, unusually hot temperatures, and a massive wildfire that was sweeping the region at the time. But I'm not going to go into detail about the Winnipeg General Strike, except to say that the turnout surprised even the leadership that had organized the strike vote. Not only organized workers, but thousands of unorganized workers, as well as union workers that were entangled in legal struggles at the time, and those unionized workers that had recently won contracts with their bosses all came out to support the demands of the strike. When this happened, the working class in Winnipeg was put in a position where it had to assume responsibility for the functioning of the city. As the old saying goes, not a wheel turns, not a phone rings, not a light bulb shines without the kind permission of the working class. This task was accomplished in Winnipeg through the elected strike committee, or Soviet in Russian terms. Even the city police were on the side of the strike, and in the absence of a reliable force with which to break the strike, a situation of dual power had arisen in which control of the city had passed into the hands of its working class. But the movement was not restricted to Winnipeg. A wave of sympathy strikes also swept the West. The issues which brought the Winnipeg workers out, union recognition, wages, and conditions, were issues relevant to the struggles of all workers. Solely on the basis of their demands being advanced in Winnipeg, workers downed tools in a host of small towns, railway junctions, and as well in larger urban centers where measures of workers' control were enacted. This attests to the revolutionary spirit baked into the history of the Western Canadian working class. Government records of the day record the anxiety of the ruling class as sympathetic strikes took Brandon, Calgary, Edmonton, Saskatoon, Prince Albert, Regina, Vancouver, and New Westminster. The labor press of the day paints an even broader picture. with reports from 20 of their locales, small towns from Western Ontario to Northern BC. Marx and Engels point out in the Communist Manifesto that every class struggle is a political struggle. Therefore, every strike is an expression of the workers' desire to control their fate. Every strike poses the question of who's in charge of the factory, and every general strike poses the question of who runs society. In the West, the history of class struggle is undeniable, but more than that, there is a revolutionary history which forms the traditions of the Western working class. And for all of Canada, a history of general strikes that served as a preparatory school for revolution because they carry within them the kernel of workers' control of society. That is a history the bourgeois would rather have from us under a heap of unprincipled revisionism. It is our task to learn the lessons, the defeats that the Canadian Revolution has endured, so that the next time class struggle puts the question of power before the working class, an organization exists that can intervene as the Marxist wing of the labor movement with a clear view of the task confronting us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Okay, so before we move on to our next speaker, who will be Abby, I just wanted to plug the bookstore here. So we'll also post a link to the bookstore over in the chat here. But yeah, if you were ever interested in, checking out some more Marxist literature, I mean, all of this fine stuff right here I got from our bookstore, so you should definitely check it out. We can ship it right to you. And yeah, we've got all sorts of great from the, the classics all the way to current analysis. So we'll put that link here, but yeah, there it is. So just check that out. And yeah, we've got lots of time here today. So if you do have, no questions too small to ask, or, any comments at all as well, we'd love to hear, from everyone here about, your experiences through the pandemic so far, any issues relating to, work here in Alberta or anything. We'd absolutely love to hear from you. So with that, we will hand it over to Abby then.
Hi, can you guys hear me? So I, before the pandemic, was working as an EA actually in schools. So I was one of the people that was laid off. One thing I found interesting though, during my time there, I was talking with the teacher I worked under, and we're both of us are unionized by different union sectors. So we'd been talking about sort of what our unions had been saying. And I know for the educational assistant union, basically what they said was it is the largest number of people without jobs for the next school year coming up because of the cuts that had happened before the COVID layoffs. So there was just an astronomical number of EAs that had no position coming up. So that's actually why I ended up choosing to leave. It was with Edmonton Public School Boards. So I chose to leave them, and I'm just working in a daycare right now. Hopefully if funding comes back, I'll go back. But I also, when I was working there talking to the teacher, she said that kind of what the plan was that was going around was that one union, their contract came up in September of this year, and then the other union, it would be in January. And so they were thinking of maybe doing a joint strike once both their contracts were up and they could legally strike, which was, I think, something that would be very cool and very exciting. I don't know too much about their strength in Alberta, but I know to Michael's question a little bit, when the Ontario Teachers Union striked, they striked for, I think, months on end, and the government there, the Ford government, ended up putting more money into funding extra daycare time than what the teachers had asked for, and then they still gave the teachers what they asked for in the end. So I hope that if the teachers and the EAs in our area do strike, we can have as much strength as that, because I know the conditions are very sad, especially for the littlest ones. They have some really horrific cuts. Children with safety issues might not even have an EA at all. They have to be incredibly severe dangers to themselves or others to have an EA, basically. So teacher has to deal with that, not to mention COVID protocols, extra cleaning, and normal teaching. Yeah, so thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, no, it's great to hear from people on, their experiences so far with everything. So I'm once again going to, plug our paper. You should definitely, check that out. This is one of our older issues here. Unfortunately, excellent covers, great content. We've got our program on the back here as well. I don't have any of the newer issues. I've been getting them online since the pandemic, but you should definitely check that out. And yeah, we'd love to hear from more people about their, experiences with, the cuts and everything, and, from workers out there on the front line of the pandemic. So, please just use that the raise hand function and let us know if you've got anything that you'd like to say. Any question or comment is greatly appreciated. So yeah, with that, then the next person we'll give it to will be Jaden then. So we'll just give it a second here just to unmute them.
Awesome. Thank you. Can you hear me? Perfect. So yeah, just to kind of expand off some of the stuff that Lane went over in his lead off. When Lane said that, it's not the same Alberta that it was 20 years ago. And I wholeheartedly agree. I would even go further and say it's not the same Alberta it was 10 or even 5 years ago, with the incredibly rapid shift in consciousness that we've been seeing from people. And a lot of that does have to do, as Lane rightly pointed out, with Alberta's inherent and intrinsic relationship with the oil industry that it's had. That kind of, in micro form, outlines the crisis of capitalism in general. That Alberta was a province, before we discovered oil, essentially of ranchers and sodbusters trying to eke out a living. And then, boom, we discover oil, and next thing you know, it's industrializing incredibly quickly. The political parties in Alberta rush to essentially, kneel before these new oil barons who are coming in with tons of wealth, tons of power, and the ability to industrialize the ruralized Alberta. And for a long time, people were suckered into thinking, well, that must mean what's good for the oil baron is good for the Albertan. And, you had 40 years alone of conservative rule just planting that idea in people's head. But as soon as that stopped, as it had to stop at some point, the oil barons kind of uprooted, packed all their treasures in their chests, and hit the road. They didn't care. They weren't here for the average Albertan. And this happened so suddenly and so kind of viciously and ruthlessly that it tore the veil from a lot of people's eyes. They were radicalized pretty instantly when they saw that our province had been allowed to be, plundered and strip mined and deforested with the promise of eternal wealth on the hard work of Albertans. And that all turned out to be a lie. And this radicalizing element, you can see it everywhere now. I'm very hard pressed to actually find anybody who genuinely loves Jason Kenney. I've met people who will vote for him, but not because they like him. They'll say, well, I hate the guy. He's a sleazeball, but what else am I going to do? And it's really, just that holding on to the UCP for lack of any kind of alternative, that's all that the Conservatives have for them now, is that old holdover from when they were the party in power of, the ruling class interest in Alberta, this massive oil monopoly. And, now people are just holding on to the idea that maybe we can go back to the time when the ruling class wasn't, screwing us over quite so violently and quite so obviously. If we could just go back to that, please, that would be nice. And yeah, really, that's what we're trying to build here. Is we're trying to build that alternative and show people that there is that clear alternative, that break away from the capitalist class, that break away from that ruling class, that will take everything from you, and when push comes to shove, give you nothing in return. And the only way to kind of do that is to start to strip away the illusions that people used to have in the system. Could you imagine what this province would have looked like if during the oil crash, the Albertan oil workers decided to organize themselves? If they had decided to say, no, we're not just going to let you skid all of us and put us all on EI. Without us, you have no oil revenue. Without us, you have no multinational billion-dollar oil empire. Or if the oil workers now decided to do that, decided to put the province on hold in alliance with teachers and nurses in order to, strike for better conditions for all workers. The Alberta working class would own this province, bar none. And that's the alternative we need to present, is that the Albertan working class only really needs to organize, radicalize, and then reach out and take what they already have, and it's theirs. And a radically different province and country and world would be completely possible. Turning these revolutionary ideas and motives and instincts that people have in these times into revolutionary action. And so I hope that everybody can kind of get on board with that and check out the paper, check out the books, and ask us more and more questions so that we can take these steps to achieving this in the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jaden. So yeah, we still have lots of time today. We'd like to hear from everyone, but yeah, so we'll just give it a second here. If you don't have if you can't find the raise hand function, it's under the participants tab at the bottom here, or you can shoot me a message in the chat here. I'll add you onto the list. Finally, we have a platform here for Albertans to fight Eastern chauvinism. So please jump on in, give us your thoughts. And yeah, I'm just going to give a second here just to see if anyone would like to have anything to say. Okay, so we'll give it over to Samiha then.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Or? It's okay, right? Okay. So I wanted to talk about the housing markets, because this is also where you see the contradictions of capitalism becoming really clear, right? So even prior to the pandemic, Canada was actually one of the top countries facing a really high risk of a housing bubble. And there was this report from last year that showed the ratio between house prices and to people's income. It was 155.3, right? And when the 2008 crisis happened, it was high oil prices and those exports to China that was kind of helping Canada with like more than the other countries. But with COVID, we have our oil price crash, and then the exports to China were also falling. And so there was this rise in national debt and also rise in debts for many Canadian households, right? They already had really bad debts, but now it only got worse. And on top of that, there was a decrease in demand in the housing market with less immigration. So in response to that, a lot of, I think it was about 6 banks, they had a deferral program for mortgage payments, and it was pretty selective, but they put this out there in order to prevent so many bankruptcies, right? And essentially that debt, it got transferred to the federal government. And so to deal with this, the federal government, they started printing more money, right? And in the end, that only increases inflation, and it worsens the standard of living for the working class, right? We had Merrill just talked about like the conditions in the trailers, right? It was overcrowded. Lane talked about how teachers were feeling more fatigued. There's more anxiety with growing debts, housing, and health. And on top of all of that, in Alberta, we had Kenney's austerity and cuts and all the layoffs. So despite this, recently, if you look up information on like the housing market, you see a lot of reports that talk about our cities actually rebounding. So they're talking about a return to stability, right? Even in Calgary, the impact was a little bit more there than in Edmonton. And all the new construction that was happening there, it also stopped. And in reality, it doesn't, all those numbers, they don't really reflect the real risk of instability in the housing market. And that's because those numbers, they're basically based on the number of sales of mortgages or number of resales of the same houses, right? Obviously not to workers, but like to wealthier people. And so ultimately that is still unproductive because you're not creating new value. And it also doesn't reflect how bad it is because deferral rates were 22% in Alberta, which is significantly higher than the national average, which was only 11%. So in Alberta, that's almost 20%, meaning 1 in 5 Albertans, right, past a 6 months period, which is expiring this month, will have to pay back their mortgage payments plus the amount of the deferred payments. So they'll have to do that even if they're still unemployed, and also CERB is also ending. So definitely there's been a growing housing bubble in Canada, and that was kind of inevitable under capitalism. And what COVID did is basically it accelerated that. And so there's a really high probability that the epicenter of when that bubble pops, it's going to be in Alberta. And when that happens, it's going to be really severe and much more severe than what happened in 2008. So last thing I want to say is that ultimately capitalists are trying to run away from all of these debt and national crises that, right, they caused through fictitious capital, right, through profit. It's artificial and it's temporary, but that's how they can keep accumulating wealth through that profit and private property. And meanwhile, we continue to see all these attacks on workers, layoffs, and we continue to even see homeless camps right next to hotels and apartment buildings with lots of vacancies. Yeah, so that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so we've still got lots of time here today. So we'll just give it a minute here just to see if there's anyone else who'd like to speak. You know, you don't have to be a master orator to, you know, participate. We'd like to hear from everyone. You know, any little question, comments, you know, how your work life has been like under the pandemic and Kenney's cut. So we'll just give it a second here and see if anyone would like to say anything. And of course, you don't have to be from Alberta to speak as well. Please, we'd love to hear from people across the country on your experiences. Yeah. Okay, we'll hand it over to Joel then, and let's hear what he has to say.
Oh, can you hear me? Very good. Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks, Lane. Very good presentation. I've enjoyed the discussion so far. There was a couple of questions that came up that I was going to maybe try to address. There was Merrill raised kind of like people know that there's a problem and they don't like the government, but they kind of feel a bit hopeless. I want to say that I think that feeling is entirely natural in this situation because people naturally don't see a way out. But I would actually, and then this I think is actually somewhat connected to what I believe it was Chad asked about religion, which is a specific question, but I think they're both connected in the sense that consciousness, and Lane touched on this a bit in his presentation, is contradictory, meaning that it evolves in a contradictory manner. It's not static. I know it says Joel from Montreal. I'm actually not from the East, so don't be hating on Easterners here. I'm from the Yukon, and I know what it's like out west, and I know what it's like in Alberta, and I know for the longest time, especially out east, people say, "Oh, Albertans are all right-wing bastards. You never have a revolution there. You'll never have NDP." I hear this NDP is hopeless. You can't win government there. I used to hear that tons of times. What happened? Oh, you won't have class struggle in Alberta. Everyone's too happy. They have all their oil money. It's land of milk and honey. You can just go there and make $100,000 a year easy. And I had some buddies that did that as well. But I think that what's happened now is this Alberta's strength has become its weakness. And I don't know if people know that famous quote from the Bible: the first will be last, and the last will be first. I think that's exactly what's happening. And look, I'm in Montreal. Montreal is known as like the protest capital of the damn country. And there was on the BLM demos, Alberta had a bigger demo than Montreal. Everyone was surprised. They're like, what? What's going on here? That's not normal, especially for a demo against racism and police brutality. So I think what's happening is a very fast advancement of consciousness in Alberta, which is amazingly progressive. But it doesn't happen all in one shot, right? It's not all layers of the population that draw the same conclusions at the same time. So there's still a lot of catching up to do, and there's still a lot of confusion. There's still a lot of, the religion thing. I know that there's a big religious sentiment in Alberta, but that's not necessarily a barrier, actually. I think there's many examples. Like, if that was a barrier, Latin America would never have revolution. The Middle East, which has been on fire with revolution, would never have revolution. The fact of the matter is, and for us as socialists, like, I'm a Marxist. Marxism is, philosophically speaking, atheist, and we're materialists. We don't believe that God exists. But that doesn't mean that we can't fight hand in hand, arm in arm with religious workers and people that want to fight for a better world, that want to fight for heaven on earth. That's what we fight for. So I don't we're not new atheists. We don't make fun of, we shouldn't be making fun of religious people and calling them stupid because of what they believe in. I'll have a nice philosophical discussion about whether or not God exists with a religious person. But for me, and I think for all of us, it should be the most important thing is the common interests. We fight against the UCP. We want to fight against capitalism. We don't support these bastards. You think this is moral? I don't care. Jason Kenney and his government, they it's like the Republicans, Trump. Oh, I'm religious. They play with this. It's nonsense. How does this uphold with the moral argument? They're basically laying people off in the middle of pandemic. This is social murder. Ultimately. Anyway, so I think a lot of religious people, their consciousness evolves very quickly, and it's not that they're not going to be religious or something like that, but they can maybe they'll be manipulated by a right-wing argument for a period of time, but then quite quickly they can become left-wing. All that prejudice against socialism and Marxism can quite quickly be shed away as they realize that the people that were telling it to them are the bastards. People know the quote in the Bible, it's easier for the camel to fit through an eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, they start to realize it's a bunch of millionaires that were spinning us a tale, that were tricking us. So I think we can use these types of arguments to win over religious people to the cause of socialism. Because look, the fact of the matter is, in the world, I don't know if this is the case in Alberta, but in the world, the majority of the population is religious. The majority of the workers are religious. We're going to have to unite workers across nationality, across ethnicity, across religion, across whatever division, gender. We have to unite people. We have to find a way to do that. And I think that's with clear class politics. I think what Lane has explained tonight is exactly what needs to be done. But yeah, I think the hopelessness thing is part of the contradictory consciousness that develops, because Alberta it's described in this situation where it's like, oh, all the money in the world just showering down, and you can get 1 million jobs, and minimum wage is just kind of almost naturally higher because there's a labor shortage. So it's just like this almost libertarian capitalist paradise for a period of time. Now that's all gone, and it's hammering people's consciousness, and the consciousness develops contradictorily. So I think a lot of people lost their jobs. They have this sense of hopelessness because they don't see what to do, what can be done. Now, our task is to show them and to actually enthuse them that it is possible to have a better world. And actually, we are more than them. That is a very important concept. As workers, we are more than them. It's not that we don't have the power, it's that we don't know that we do. And the working class people are not, we're not organized enough. So we need to help workers organize. And that's what we're trying to do here. And to organize, you have to first be conscious and be aware. So we should, Merrill raises, you should enthuse your workmates and try to excite them about the prospects and raise their sights, because you can be hopeless. But I think there's a good quote I also like from the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky, who said, "Revolution is impossible until it is inevitable." So I think in the eyes of probably a lot of people in Alberta, they probably think, well, look at this UCP government. We freaking voted for them. And now it's like this ogre just smashing us over the head and there's nothing we can do about it. A revolution. Yeah, that would be nice. But that's going to happen until it is inevitable. And I think Kevin talked about this. Albertan workers have some damn revolutionary traditions if you go back far enough. And they'll rediscover those traditions real quick. And I think we titled this discussion Perspectives for Revolution in Alberta for a reason. That's not just to be provocative or clickbaity and try to get people to attend the event. It's because I think that is actually on the agenda. I think that it is, even if you look at America, if you look at the US used to be one of these places where, it's right wing, George Bush, the war in Iraq, bunch of racist rednecks. Socialism would never be popular there. Now look what's happening. It's if you want to look at the future of Alberta, you have to look at places like the US. I think the good thing is we've been building our group there for a little while now, and we're actually being quite successful. And so the point is to build the forces of Marxism in advance of these mass revolutionary events. So I don't know if I respond to the questions, but I think that, yeah, the hopelessness and the kind of confused nature of consciousness, that's entirely natural, what's happening. But I think we shouldn't let that deter us. I think we should be confident. We should be the most confident people about the future, and we should have confidence in the working class and in the Albertan working class.
Thank you very much. Okay, so next up on the list here, we'll have Sergey, and then after Sergey, we'll have Peter. So we'll go ahead with Sergey first here.
Hello, everyone. I just have a couple questions more than I want to say any thoughts. So I just understand, does our organization work with some labor union? Because I think it's the fastest way, right, to organize people and move them in direction. Because, and another stuff, because already a lot of people lost job and they're kind of individuals and they're isolated, they don't know anything. Do we have, I don't know, some voice on YouTube platform, let's say, because yeah, newspaper is good, but there is like people right now on YouTube and they're watching, and it will be easier like to get to their heads, like if you're there and create some, I don't know, even some small videos like 5 minutes. At least like that's what is trendy right now in at least in Russia, as I know. And people are watching it. There is different content about educated, about the news, what is going on with analytics. I think it helps people and movement is growing there. I just don't know, do we do it or not? And something else I wanted to say. Okay, maybe I remember it later. That's all. It was my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So actually, yeah, in response to that, actually, brings up a good point. You know, we do have some of those channels, so we'll see if we can get some of the links put right in the chat here. But I know that a few of our sections in different countries, including Fight Back, we do actually have some lectures, lead-offs and stuff on Spotify, other podcast providers. And we do have a YouTube channel, I believe, for the International Marxist Tendency. So we'll get some of those links in the chat here as well. Yeah, so next up we will have Peter. So if we'll get Peter unmuted here.
Hi. Good lead off. I was going to answer Chad's question, but Joel did such a really good in-depth job that the answer I have, I realize, is pretty flip, but I'll give it anyway. So, Chad, you could tell your more religious friends that Jesus was a utopian socialist, and that Mr. Marx and Mr. Engels and the scholarship that's been done since then has come up with a scientific foundation for socialism and a communist society. I did have a question of my own. It's about unions, or whether it's possible in Canada to create a very broad union movement instead of trade unions. I know that there are some worldwide unions like the IWW, and they are in Canada. But for instance, the disabled need representation in the union movement, and I'm wondering if someone can address that. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much. So next up, we will have, let's see here, we'll have Enrique up next. And we're also going to post some of our links here as well to our Twitter account. We've also got that going. So if you're on Twitter, check us out there. We've got an account there. There's also a Canada-wide Fight Back account. And we'll give it over to Enrique now.
Hello. Thanks, everyone. A really good lead off. Thanks, everybody who's participating. So we talked about the necessity of revolution here in Alberta. I think there's not really a lack of reasons to have one as we've been covering. And this is a very tall task, but who is actually going to carry this out, right? Is it going to be this cartoon version of a worker, like somebody with like a hard hat and a big ass wrench and dirt all over him? Is that who's going to do it? Does it mean that me, a lowly bus driver or a food service worker, can just sit this one out and let those guys do it? I really don't think so, right? I want everybody who's watching this to sort of stop and think about where you fit into this equation. Because as a working person, you do hold immense power. And while industrial workers do hold a great potential to cripple the capitalist, they aren't the majority of our class. In fact, in Alberta, forestry, fishing, mining, quarrying, oil and gas, all of those workers only make up 6% of the workforce, or about 145,000 workers. This is slightly less than accommodation and food services, many of whom are unionized. Educational services is 6.7%, scientific services nearly 8%, and construction and retail each are slightly above 10%. Actually, the highest percentage of employed are in the healthcare sector, right? 12.5%, or almost 300,000 workers. So the question again is, who will fight these battles? Who will undoubtedly come? And it's going to be a collection of all of these workers. It's going to be the industrial workers, the nurses, the teachers, the laundry workers, the meat packing workers, the farm workers, right? The construction workers. They are the ones who are going to fight this revolution, right? Not a very small subset. It has to be all of us. Even the students and the unemployed have a role to play. There is a tradition of organizing the unemployed workers back from the Bolshevik movement and before, right? It has to be the whole class. And Alberta's labor history really bears this out. In 1993, it was the laundry workers in Calgary, or 1995, who launched an illegal wildcat strike against the privatization and layoffs from the client conservatives against the health sector. In 2005, it was meat packing plant workers at Brooks, one of the plants hardest hit by COVID, that launched the strike and unionized because of the efforts of mostly immigrant and temporary foreign workers, many of whom had fled their home countries as refugees. The first time the Edmonton Riot Squad was used was against strikers at the Gainers meatpacking plant in Edmonton in 1986. Right, that same year, all of the Alberta Liquor Board workers went on strike province-wide. Right, then you have the nurses in 88, teachers in 2001. These workers have been at the forefront of the labor movement in the past, and it's really no different today. The key here is that no single group of these workers can fight alone. Right? They can't stay isolated. We must hurt the capitalists with the combined effort of the working class. Right? The police can't move around the city if utility workers block the roads, the rails, and the bridges. The lights and the heat at the legislature need workers to turn them on. Right? The massive food production in Alberta runs on immigrant and temporary foreign worker labor and can be taken over if organized. Again, if you are not an industrial worker, do not think you can sit these struggles out. There is a place for you in the struggle. And above all, we must learn why all these different strikes have stayed isolated and have oftentimes failed. Nurses in 88, teachers in 2001, right? We need to know why these struggles fail, and most importantly, we must know how to connect all of these to one another, right? The struggle of the locked out Cesco Boilermakers in Edmonton right now is the same struggle that the teachers are facing, because the war being waged on them is a war for profits from the ruling class, and that's really what we need to underline here. And yeah, at the end of the day, right, the people in this call aren't going to be the ones that are going to overthrow Kenney, right? The working class is going to do that. We in this room aren't going to end the opioid crisis. The working class is going to do that. We in this room fight back. The small amount of Marxists in Alberta are not going to defeat the far right of the province. The working class is going to do that. What we must really be is sort of the living memory of these past struggles in Alberta. We must learn these lessons, we must study them, and we must transmit them into our workplaces, our unions, our schools. We must prepare ourselves during this time to build the revolutionary organizations which will be needed to take power immediately after we throw Kenney into the North Saskatchewan River. And it's going to take all of the food workers, the healthcare workers, the teachers, and every other working class person in this province to do it. There is no other way. That's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So yeah, we've got some of our links up in the chat there. Yeah, you can check out our Twitter. We even got a TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Spotify, YouTube. So please, check all those out. Yeah, so I'm also going to take a last call after these last few speakers here. So if you would like to get on the list, give me a shout. But so next up, we will have Michael, and we'll follow them up with Cheryl. So we'll hand it over to Michael now.
Okay. My second question is, how could Marxism explain Wexit?
Perfect, thank you. I'm sure Lane will be excited to touch on that one in the wrap up here. Okay, we'll hand it over to Cheryl now.
Thanks, Emil. There's lots I want to say. I'm also sort of mentally noting all the places that we're deciding to throw Jason Kenney. I think our Tailings Pond, North Saskatchewan. There's probably lots of other places we could think. I'm really glad to hear, Abby, when you were talking, that the teachers, and I think you might have said the EAs as well, or at least a few different unions were thinking about, oh, maybe we could have a joint strike. That really makes me happy, because I was sort of I've been seeing everything that's happening in the province, and being a parent, also looking at the school reopening, the lack of a plan, this sort of like, okay, the messaging saying, we know there's going to be infections. So it's not even a matter of like trying to not have infections. It's like, well, that's just going to be a reality. And thinking like, that sounds like, okay, now you're asking all these teachers and teaching assistants and any other staff to put themselves in harm's way and not giving any extra money. So I was thinking, well, like, where's the people saying we're going to strike, or this isn't, we don't want to come back to an unsafe workplace. I was talking with someone who used to be a teacher, also, I think, married to a teacher, and saying that, well, there's like rules around it, and it wouldn't be legal for them to strike, that there's like certain times to do that. So anyway, I thought that was interesting and funny, because it's like asking for permission to stand up for yourself kind of thing. So I hope that happens, that some action happens there, that we can get more for the teachers. They're really, it's such a crazy, stressful time, like both for parents and for teachers. And it's you know, I did send a note to my daughter's teacher to let her know, like, hey, just so you know, if teachers decide to strike, I support you fully. Like I'm there with you. Like I wanna like basically shake my fist at the government and say this isn't acceptable. So there's lots more I could say. Just like all the legislation that's been passed in the last 6 months. It's horrendous to see, and that feeling like, we're gonna get almost another 3 years of this. Like I don't know about all of you, but I don't really want to wait 3 years. I want to do something. So it's nice to see everybody here and love all the discussion. And that's all I really had to say. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So last call for speakers now. I'm just going to hand it over to Marcus now. After that, if there aren't any more, speakers who would like to, any final questions or comments, then we'll give it back to Lane. And, Lane will do a wrap up here, answer all those questions that we had, and then we'll go into the breakout rooms. So I'll explain the breakout rooms and everything after that. And but for now, we'll just hand it over to Marcus here.
Hey, can you hear me okay? Yeah, hello, I'm Marcus. I'm here speaking with Socialist Fight Back. And I really just kind of want to talk about the far right, because as much as Alberta is kind of painted as this, conservative, sanctuary, this bastion of right-wing politics, it's also very often painted as this kind of hotbed of fascism and white supremacy. Now, this isn't totally true, and I'll get into why that isn't really true. But, this kind of statement, this idea does reflect some true figures. There's actually a study conducted by the Organization for the Prevention of Violence, and the study came out last year. And it found out that there's actually been a significant increase in reported hate crimes and right-wing organizing in just the past few years, to actually a pretty shocking degree. Between 2014 and 2017, there was a 78% increase in reported hate crimes. I mean, it's shocking, to say the least. Now, this kind of movement on the right that we've been seeing can be explained just by the fact that, we are in a crisis. The entire country's been in a crisis recently, but Alberta's, been in a very real, very serious economic crisis since, about 2014, and that's obviously had its political consequences. In these kinds of crises, we do see this generalized polarization of society. These kind of traditional liberal bourgeois institutions begin to lose all of their credibility, and people seek out radical solutions both on the left, which thankfully been seeing with the success of Fight Back, but also to a degree on the right. Now, that being said, really the strength of the far right is constantly overinflated. Contrary to what certain hysteric leftists on Facebook might tell you, Alberta is not on the verge of entering into like a weird fascist regime, right? As a matter of fact, despite these kinds of hate crimes and these kinds of sporadic instances, we do see, unfortunately, the far right as a cohesive, organized political force is actually pretty weak. We can really look at, the Soldiers of Odin, for example, this kind of, anti-immigration far right, hate group. They're so weak, they've had to resolve and reform themselves so many times that I've lost count of what stupid name they even use to call themselves anymore. Like first there were Soldiers of Odin, then there were Wolves of Odin, which is just embarrassing, frankly. I think they called themselves like the Canadian Guard for a while. Like I said, I couldn't tell you what they're calling themselves now. Or we could look at, the last year's really farcically named, Yellow Vest movement, right? Where it was this kind of, right-wing movement that did pick up. They had marches in the street. Really, the organized protests lasted maybe a week. And then after that, all the Yellow Vest movement was like maybe a couple guys on a good day standing out in front of the legislature, yelling at random people. Again, not a real cohesive political force. But also, I feel like this is also pretty evident just in the great success in these recent Black Lives Matter protests that we saw just recently, right? there was a lot of fear mongering on, again, certain sections of the online left about the possibility of attacks from fascists, during these events. But in practice, when the right-wingers even bother to show up to these protests, they're completely swamped out by the massive crowds of counter-protesters. Myself and some other people with Fight Back were at the protest in Edmonton. If there were any right-wingers there trying to start anything, I sure as hell didn't notice them. Nobody I've spoken to noticed them. If they were there at all, they were basically completely swamped out, right? We could also kind of look at what happened in the tiny town of Innisfail. The protest that happened there, because there was a protest there, was actually delayed due to these sorts of online threats from right-wingers. Now, this is a very unfortunate situation, of course, but the reaction to this was really incredible. The local organizers basically immediately received this massive wave of support, and when the rally did end up happening after all, it had a really fantastic turnout. About 300 people showed up, which doesn't seem that big, but just consider this is a town of 8,000 people. I've been to rallies in Edmonton that have had less than 300 people. And again, it's the exact same situation. You did see some right-wingers show up to this protest and try to disrupt it, but there are just so many people there that they had to leave early. They couldn't do anything. And really the kind of point of me bringing this up is that it's really clear to see that this movement of the Alberta workers that we've been seeing, and we've only been beginning to see it, has been incredibly disruptive to any attempt to consolidate the far right of Alberta into this cohesive political force. And the really incredible thing is that, these working class movements that we've seen so far have been almost entirely sporadic without any clear political leadership or organization or any party or any program. They've been very kind of, out of the blue in that certain sense, right? So what this all goes to show is if we do kind of organize, we do build a militant, bold left-wing party that can actually bring all these movements together, bring all these forces together under a common banner, then just this will be enough to completely wash out, all of these kinds of far-right social scum that we see in Alberta. These people, hardly have a leg to stand on anymore. And it's really about consolidating our own forces that will really kind of deal the final blow to them. That's really all I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you very much. And now it looks like we don't have any more speakers, so we'll hand it back to Lane, and he's going to do the wrap up, and then we'll move into the breakout room. So take it away, Lane.
All right, thank you, Emil. Just quickly on the question, I think a few questions were answered quite well, especially about religion. But I did want to add that there really, there is, of course, a contradiction between Marxism and any theology. Marxists are not religious, right? But there is no contradiction generally between Christianity and socialism, or being Muslim and socialism, or Buddhist or whatever. I would argue personally that Jesus was a communist abolitionist carpenter. That early Christianity was an abolitionist, wanted to abolish slavery, and was actually a working class Jewish movement in Judea. And you could see that from some of the Bible quotes. Joel already mentioned a few, but some of my favorites. If a man shuts his ears to the cry of the poor, he too will cry out and not be answered. And another is, you cannot serve both God and money. So yeah, if you're discussing with your family, I'd personally use moral arguments and quotes from the Bible. Let's see. Merrill asked about, about people, about workers in Fort Mac and their lack of confidence, being trapped in debt. How do they fight in this situation? And I think this is a question of confidence, right? And this is one of the problems, actually. And this relates to another question about the trade union movement, is that at this time, in an economic downturn, it's like simple trade unionism, trying to, use the leverage that you have within the union to withdraw labor to go on strike, is not nearly as effective as it is, in an economic boom, right? Like if unemployment is high, if profits are fairly scant, the ruling class, likely could just leave town, actually just close up shop, say it's not worth it. It could shut down operations, or could probably find scabs easier than if the economy was booming, right? If there was a capital frenzy. It exposes that limits, but that doesn't mean that lack of confidence is always going to be there. It could go two ways, right? Either the workers could regain confidence, from some way, or they can hit a lower limit, meaning that they cannot live as they had previously, right? Is that actually the wages are getting too low, their costs and their expenses are getting too high, and things cannot go on like that. So yeah, this lack of confidence is not it doesn't mean that there won't be any class struggle at all when the economy is bad. It's not at all a linear relationship. It's a very complex and interacting relationship, right, between consciousness and the economic situation. A boom doesn't mean class peace, and a slump doesn't mean class war either. But in this case, I think we can point to an elevating consciousness, and we can see that class battles are on the horizon. I think that's as particular as you could really be right now. Big class battles, of course. Let's see. Oh yeah, this bit about the EAs and the teachers going on a joint legal strike. I think that is fantastic. If the EAs and teachers were to strike together. However, the problem of legality if rhetoric is coming like that from representatives of the trade unions, I think that they should, I don't think they understand really the extent of the hatred that Kenney actually has for trade unionism and for workers and for regular people. Actually, is that he wouldn't hesitate a second or a heartbeat to actually make any strike, no matter how just, illegal. And he has, basically spent his time in office doing his best to make strikes illegal or ineffective, and give himself the power, or his cabinet the power, to make them illegal. So that the EAs and teachers plan to go on strike together is fantastic. It's good. It's better than striking alone. However, it should be discussed in these unions that there is a strong need to defy back to work legislation. If any public sector union, if I owned a house, I'd bet it on this, but if any public sector union went on strike under this government, Kenney would, actually legislate it back to work as quickly as possible. He stated his desire to do that. It's like he gets excited and flushed about the prospect of doing that. And so we have to understand that we have to actually defy this back to work legislation. That is just a piece of paper. And then with that, when you're actually willing to struggle, we could give this government a black eye. And I think that's what is needed, actually, is a strike for safety, for cleaning in the schools, for decent conditions, and for the education, for the sake of the children, right? You have schools with single teachers, again, like using chemicals like Oxavar, don't know what that is, how dangerous it is. In a cramped classroom, in some rural areas, class sizes up to 40 people. I've heard larger, right? This is not a good situation whatsoever, and it doesn't have to be this way. Teachers in Detroit, Michigan, threatened strike action to get class sizes capped, and the city caved. And class sizes were capped at 20 people. Now, Detroit has no money, absolutely no money. I visited Michigan last summer. We drove through, and on the side of the road, the grass is about 5 feet tall. There's dead raccoons everywhere, and there are buildings crumbling. The city is in a state of destitute poverty, and there's absolutely no money. And yet they were somehow able to cap class sizes at 20 people. I think that's the power of the working class, and something we should import, because there's not much exports coming out of Detroit anymore. Let's see. Oh, is it possible to create a broad union movement? I think that's what we need, actually. The more broad the struggle is, the better our chances of success, actually. And kind of on that note, a lot of the trade unions we talk about are fairly historied, right? For example, UFCW is quite broad. It's actually all over North America. It's not limited to Canada. The Firefighters Association, that firefighters are unionized with here in Edmonton, is also North America wide. A lot of the larger unions began this way, and we should work towards that unity, but on a socialist basis, right? And work towards actually militant trade unionism on a very wide, as wide of a basis as possible. And I think a broad union movement in Alberta is, what we need. But again, trade unions do have their limits, like I had mentioned earlier. And so we also need to actually put forward demands politically and use other methods as well. Let's see. And finally, the Wexit question. This is a good one. I haven't paid too much attention to Wexit. It hasn't really been in the news since the pandemic. There have kind of been bigger fish to fry. But I think you could explain it in this way. I think you could say that historically there has been a division between the ruling classes in Canada, between different wings. Of course, the oil barons in Alberta are dominant, and they are still dominant. They have been dominant. But that's not the case throughout Canada, right? Actually, the oil barons have been in a complete frenzy about, Trudeau, about pipelines, about this and that, about bailing out oil and gas. For example, there was that $1 billion when the beginning of the COVID stimulus was starting to come out. There was $1 billion allocated to clean up orphan wells. When I saw that, I thought to myself, the oil barons are going to be insulted by that. And that was put forward by I'd say the most dominant wing in the Canadian bourgeoisie, which is not based out of Calgary. It's really based off of Toronto and Bay Street, based off of finance and real estate, these kind of sectors. They'd write their articles in the Globe and Mail, whereas the oil barons would, publish their material within the National Post. And of course, the National Post, after that bailout came out, they were mad. Somebody wrote an article being mad it was only $1 billion. Now, in the past while, the oil barons have lost ground. They have been on the decline, right? Since Harper was kind of their guy, and now they've lost that. Now we have a pretty boy in Justin Trudeau, right? And so they have political aspirations. They would like their pipelines approved in a timely manner. They would like to, crush whatever dissent with the RCMP as quickly as possible. And the other wing of the bourgeoisie, Justin Trudeau, he doesn't represented by Justin Trudeau, don't really feel that way. Actually, they're kind of a little bit more clever about it. They don't want to provoke confrontations like that. So the oil barons there's a struggle here between these two wings of the bourgeoisie. And the oil barons try to use whatever leverage they can get. Jason Kenney, for example, has actually discussed a referendum on equalization payments. Right? This would be a disaster. It doesn't make any sense. Jason Kenney actually made the current formula for equalization payments, but is trying to leverage what he has actually to push Ottawa in the direction that the oil barons want to take it. And then with that, there is the Wexit movement. This is a very confused, contradictory, and marginal movement. It is really quite small, and it was spurred on by the media when it was in its spotlight. For an example on its confusion, just a few months ago, or maybe it was about a month ago, there were some billboards that went up in downtown Edmonton saying, "Should Canada join the United States?" And so first their demand was separation, and then the demand is turning to joining the United States, right? This is from Peter Downing, I think. There's a few different strands of this movement here. I think as Marcus outlined, the right wing is going to react to the crisis in a few different ways. People are going to move in different directions. This Wexit movement is a little bit astroturfed as well. There is a decent amount of money behind it, pushing it in a certain direction. But it's made up of the most confused and contradictory elements who don't really have any they're not politically homogenous, if you know what I mean. They're quite marginal. So I think if you talk to every person who believes that Alberta should separate, is going to have very different opinions than every other person who thinks that Alberta should separate. At least that's been my experience. But I don't think this is the strangest thing that's going to come out of the next period, right? Again, as Marcus talked about, like revolution and counter-revolution are really two wings that we have to contend with in this era of crisis. And we'll be dealing with a lot of other strange metamorphoses. Who knows how important they'll become. But I mean, during the fall of feudalism, you had people who would go around self-flagellating, beating themselves on the back, talking about how the world was ending. Under capitalism, the end of capitalism, I don't think we have anything that is quite the exact same thing. Maybe the flat earth movement is a good example, but they don't really see a way out of the crisis, right? So they look for something, and if there is like a basis for it in their minds, then they'll move to it. But again, at this time, it really is quite marginal. Same thing with the far right is there's so few of them, and there are so many of us that they're very weak, and I don't think we even really need to talk about them anymore. And I just want to mention a few things, a little bit about the NDP and Rachel Notley. There was an article that came out recently about how Notley can't wait to run in 2023. And I think that's indicative of something that's quite unfortunate. Cheryl mentioned this as well, is that the NDP is confronting this in a purely electoral way. They think that Parliament is the only course of action, and that's going to get them nowhere. And actually, it'll probably lose them support if they continue to think this way. The masses would probably move right past the NDP if they think that this is the only way to actually fight the UCP, because people can't wait until 2023. That's in 3 years. Well, 3 years, no, 2 years and 2 months, right? And that is quite a long time considering the cuts that we have already suffered, considering the deferrals that are going to run out, considering the foreclosures that are going to follow, considering the government money that is coming up dry, and the bailouts that are coming up dry, and the layoffs that have taken place, and the crisis that we're staring at the barrel at. We cannot wait until 2023. And in that situation, moderation and parliamentary cretinism is going to get them nowhere. They had this strategy of trying to basically, appeal to the UCP base, say that, we can be the best managers for capitalism, that we can actually do the best managing for the oil industry, for the entire economy. And the UCP is going to do a very bad job. We'll do a very good job of managing capitalism. That seems to be the exact same strategy that they're pursuing. And there is no basis whatsoever for that stability. That is a losing strategy. And they really should change and switch that. And the last thing I want to say is honestly, specifically to the people of Alberta in this chat. If you're from Canada, elsewhere in Canada, you can listen and it applies, but more actually to the people in Calgary, which is that we want to build a presence in your city. In Fight Back, we have quite a lot of members here. We're a fairly significant force. I'd say we're the largest group on the left by a country mile. Sadly, we're not enormous, but we are the biggest group, and we want to expand our base in Alberta, and especially in Calgary. We want to fight the oil barons where they feel the most comfortable, which is in that unfortunate city. In Calgary, you guys have a lot to atone for. The birthplace of Ralph Klein, Stephen Harper, Jason Kenney hangs out there in his downtime. They voted overwhelmingly for the UCP. I have no doubt that consciousness is changing there. I'm sure something is different. I know you didn't actually cause this. If you do live in Calgary, it's not your fault, but you can be a part of the solution. So I'd strongly encourage you to reach out to us and to help us build, the forces for revolutionary Marxism all over Alberta, especially in Calgary. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you so much, Lane. So with that, we'll move into the breakout rooms here. And this way we can have a little more casual discussion. So, just bear with me a couple minutes here while I set all that up and get everyone into a room here. So yeah, just 1 second here.